So now we are recording this session. Thank you for attending in a formal sense. This is Dr. Lee Jones coming to you live and direct out of Atlanta, Georgia. And this is our discussion on interest groups. Let's look at a definition of interest groups before we get started. Here is a definition of interest groups. An interest group is an organized group of individuals that are looking to use their money to apply political pressure to elected officials and candidates, with the goal being to influence elections. Let's say that again. So an interest group is an organized group of individuals who are looking to use their money so that they can apply political pressure and make persuasive arguments in the goal of influencing the election. Why does an interest group want to influence the election? The goal is to get their favored candidate elected into office. Well, why does an interest group want their favorite candidate elected into office? Because elected officials have the opportunity to vote on policies, and they get to develop the laws. They get to influence court decisions by influencing those who get nominated for the bench. Interest groups then get to influence the development of policy. Why does an interest group want to influence the development of policy? They want to do this so that they can provide benefits for the members of their group: financial benefits, purposive benefits, solidary benefits. So at bottom, an interest group is an organized group of people who are looking to use money to influence elections, to get their favorite candidates elected into office so that they can influence the development of public policy. Now, in the other recording, you're going to see some things about Alexis de Tocqueville and the First Amendment. But for here, I want us to pay some attention to the key functions of the interest groups. Functions of the interest groups. We earlier just said that the key function of an interest group is to influence an election, right? So by endorsing candidates and rating candidates, the interest group then advertises the positions of the elected officials for their members. Interest groups then are going to mobilize campaign volunteers. They're going to mobilize voters, and in so doing, the interest group provides an avenue by which regular citizens can engage in the political process. So these activities then, along with the enormous amount of money that an interest group spends, allows that interest group to influence elections. Let's look at the amount of money that interest groups spend to influence elections. Let's go to this one here. This webpage is called opensecrets.org. opensecrets.org. What they do is they watch money. They look at how money is influencing the electoral process. So look at these numbers. These numbers are specific to a 1-year time span, right? 2019, 2020. And what you see here is that these are enormous. This is $400 million from the financial and real estate industry, right? Health industry, $141 million. Lobbyists, lawyers, and such. When you combine this money together, you're going to find that over $3 billion are spent by interest groups to influence the development of policy. Close. Right? So interest groups then look to influence the development of policy. What they're looking to do is either educate the public or provide an avenue by which people are engaged in the civic discourse so that interest groups can influence elections, in large part by inspiring some type of dialogue about the policy problems as that interest group sees it. And in so doing, they're looking to provide solutions, put solutions in front of the national agenda, right? Another thing that interest groups look to do is they look to educate the members of the group and then educate the elected officials about the rectitude of their policy goals, right? And so let's say you want let's say you're going to be a teacher and you want teachers to have nice salaries, you want pay equity for male and female teachers, and then you also want schools to be funded adequately so that teachers don't have to spend their paychecks to give things, to buy things for their students. So one of the things you're going to do then is you're going to join that teachers union. And when you join the union, you have someone that's looking to, one, protect your job, and then secondly, represent you in front of elected officials so that you can get your policy goals achieved, representing and educating the members of the interest group. Another thing that interest groups look to do is they provide an avenue through which average citizens, regular citizens, are able to engage the political process. In the earlier recording, we talk about the First Amendment, and we look at Alexis de Tocqueville's contribution to our interpretation of that First Amendment. You'll recall that the First Amendment says that that you have the right to freedom, you have the freedom of assembly so that you can petition the government for a redress of grievances. That then is to say that anyone can join an interest group, anyone can be an interest group entrepreneur and start that interest group themselves. The most wealthy and most educated people are most likely to do so. However, interest groups that have advocated for poor and working class people across racial and gender lines, these interest groups have ultimately changed American society, right? Historically in the United States, interest groups have been significant forces that advocate for civil liberties and civil rights for African Americans, as well as for women, the LGBT community, and other ethnic minorities. You folks, you young people, you guys can start and fund your own interest groups as well. Let me pause for a second. I'll tell you a quick story. In my young years, right back when I was in my late teens, early 20s in undergrad, we all decided that we was going to do something, right? We wanted to affect the city council election in Atlanta this is in the 1980s, huh? So what we did is we said everyone that we were broke, and I'm not talking about broke, I'm talking about broke, right? So we said everyone is going to come back from the summer break and you're going to have $100 and we're going to get $1,000 or so together and we're going to call ourselves, I forget the name, we called ourselves some generic name, and we used that 1,000, it came up to like $1,200, but we used that money, called ourselves a group and said we want candidates to come to our campus, one, because we didn't even have like cab fare to get there, but we wanted them to come to our campus and tell them what they were going to do for us so that we could potentially give them this campaign contribution, right? In the name of our little college group. And do you know that those people came, they called us Mr. They brought Krispy Kreme donuts, they brought drinks, coffee and sweet tea and such. And it was like an interesting thing, right? So that is to say that it does not take, you don't have to have any advanced anything. You can be 20 years old and get a couple of your friends together, pull together some money, and then you can get, I'm not saying that you're going to get like the president to come to your campus, but I'm saying you can get, some attention to your policy goals. All right. Another key function of the interest group in the best case scenario is to be a check and a balance against other interest groups and against other policymakers. You'll recall that in the best case scenario, when things are working well, your interest group is going to get your favored policy item into law, into a policy of one aspect of the bureaucracy. In the best case scenario, you're going to get what you want, right? However, the interest group then performs an oversight function where they watch the development of that policy that they fought for in order to make sure that the policy is having the desired effect. If your policy is to fund schools because you are a teacher and you actually get a funding referenda passed that puts more money into the school, then you want to make sure that that money is going towards the, school supplies for students, for example, instead of going towards an increase in salary for the chancellor of your system. So a check and a balance that interest groups then provide for the common good. All right, so I wanted to make sure we did some of that. Those are some of the functions of interest groups. Now, let's look at the danger of interest groups. The danger of interest groups. Let me fast forward. I want you to check out this comment by E.E. Schatzsnyder, right? Schatzsnyder is a rather famous political analyst. In 1960, he wrote this book called The Semi-Sovereign People. And Schatzsnyder famously said that the flaw in the pluralist heaven is that the heavenly chorus sings with a strong upper class accent. That is to say that rather than being broadly representative of the American people, the interest groups, the system of interest group competition at its most effective generally only represents a small, isolated, and privileged sector of the American economy. Okay, so what does that mean for us? I want you folks to think about your family and think about how much money your family has contributed to influence the outcome of elections. Interest group activity, and we just said that, we're talking $3 billion a year. How much of that money came from your household? Okay, so we're saying here that interest groups use their massive amounts of money, depending on how well funded the interest group is, in order to buy access to elected officials and then to be able to influence the activities of those elected officials. Interest group and the funding allows these groups to trade on their influence, right? Remember this fundamental maxim of politics: organized money and organized people defeat unorganized people, right? Organized money and organized people are then able to get the political system to do the things that they want. It might be the case that the amount of money flowing through the political system is a corrupting force. If money influences how legislation is written, if money influences how policies are implemented, and the most well-funded people are able to thus influence the development of those policies, then that means that the rank and file citizens, people who don't have money to contribute to the political process, working class Americans, maybe they don't get what they want. So the question is, do corporate donations corrupt politics? But in a 5-year time span, the 200 most politically active corporations spent $5.8 billion to lobby to influence the government. And in return for their spending $5.8 billion, and because they were able to get policies written in their favor, they received $4 trillion in federal businesses, federal support. Spend $5.8 billion, receive $4 trillion. That is a good deal, right? Let's keep on going. This thing is about to warm me. Now let's look at some individuals, right? Interest group activity, and what we're talking about are the perhaps dangerous relationships. Right now, before I even go into this next section, rank and file American citizens, regular working class people, do have the ability to join their civic organizations, join your environmental groups, join your local unions, and you can, based on your membership dues, fund your organization such that it can, you as a collection of people, we're talking tens of thousands sometimes of people who join their union, can make themselves into a political economic powerhouse that can stand up to the billionaire 1% donor class. That is possible. But let's talk about how money has influenced American politics in the current administration. One individual that we can point to is Robert Mercer. Hold on, let me find the exact article. I wanted to show you guys a little something right here. I got it. Okay, let's think about Robert Mercer. I don't know if you've heard of him, but Robert and his daughter, Rebecca Mercer, is one of the newer, perhaps, but one of the most influential Republican donors in the country. Robert Mercer was a computer scientist. He came up with some kind of algorithm that would make essentially drive profits to people that are investing in various businesses. So he started this hedge fund called Renaissance Technologies, I believe, turned him into a billionaire. Robert Mercer then was able to use his money in the 2016 election cycle to support Ted Cruz for president. And when it was clear that Ted Cruz was not going to win, he turned his attentions and his contributions towards supporting Donald Trump. Let's go to the heading of this article. This article here, let me put it in the chat box so you can read it later at your leisure. Boom and boom, right? So that's it there, right? Now, this article here, again, from opensecrets.org, I'm using their work as authoritative. They're looking at the people who helped fund Donald Trump's campaign. And you see here that at the top of them is Robert. His daughter's name is Rebecca. His wife's name is Diana. So Robert Mercer and Renaissance Technologies, they spent $15 million to support individual, right, as themselves, spent $15 million to support Donald Trump's run for the presidency. I'm doing this wrong. Hold on. Let me see if I can make this thing a little bigger. Okay, check this out, right? Okay, so you also see that Mercer donated $1 million to the inaugural committee. You do a quick Google search and you'll find that that inaugural committee was, they did some very odd things with the funding, odd to say the least. So these people were able to contribute to the Trump campaign, and in response, they were able to put their favored employees inside the Trump campaign, inside the Trump White House, and then some of them are able to turn their contributions to getting jobs inside the Trump administration themselves in the name of Linda McMahon. Now let's look at this, and let's look at what Robert Mercer, let's look at his influence. Robert Mercer, through his links to the Heritage Foundation and their funding of same, they were able to put Steve Bannon and Kellyanne Conway inside the Trump administration. You'll remember that Steve Bannon, with his links to the right-wing, let's say nationalist, let's say white supremacist webpage called Breitbart.com, he was able to put Steve Bannon at the head of the campaign, and then Steve Bannon becomes, at least in 2017, a top policy advisor to the Trump administration, right? He left that position shortly thereafter now, but Kellyanne Conway, she's still on deck now, right? She's still involved in the administration now. So I'm using this as an example that corporate money does have the ability to influence people who work for your, corporate money does have the ability to influence the activities and the, staffing of the White House. Okay, let's do this last piece and then let me go forward a little bit, right? So we want to look at some of the functions of lobbying. This stuff here about rational choice theory, public choice theory, demosclerosis, we've put that, I've got a recording for that, so please go back and watch it. All right, now let's look here. Let's look at the functions of lobbying. We looked at it earlier in the recording. Here we're going to finish, right? One key function of lobbying is called representation. Representation is a key function of lobbying, right? What the interest group looks to do is represent its members before elected officials and inside the political processes. So these elected, your interest group looks to influence the activities of bureaucrats. It looks to influence the stories that are produced and published by the media. The interest group is looking to influence the votes, the policy decisions of the elected officials, and even the interest group is looking to influence the decisions rendered by judges. All of this to favor the goals that the interest group has. When an interest group is successful in getting the government's attention and getting their issues on the government's political agenda, then that interest group has successfully built an agenda. Agenda building is where they get attention for their issues, right? So the interest groups in the strong case scenario, I want you to think about some of the most influential interest groups in the United States, right? The National Rifle Association. Okay, what they actually have the power to do is actually write the bills, right? You think about the pharmaceutical lobby and they're writing the Medicare prescription drug bill. You think about the healthcare lobby and how they were able to write the Affordable Care Act. They actually get to write these bills, and then they get elected officials to sign on board, not the elected official to write them, but the elected official sponsors and then looks to push those things through Congress. By way of representing their members before government, the interest group looks to testify at open hearings in Congress, right, in order to influence the development of that bill. And they're going to provide the analysis, they're going to do the research. The interest group is going to provide the political information that says this member is more sympathetic to our views than the others. The interest group is going to provide a cost-benefit analysis for various areas, provide all of this information to the elected officials, provide it to the media in order to influence public opinion, to get the citizens to support the goals of that interest group. I want you to think about the policy where, daggone it, I lost the name of it. The policy where if you've got a weapon and you feel threatened, you can use that weapon to kill the person that you think is threatening you. This is the thing that happened to Trayvon Martin when he was chased and harassed by George Zimmerman. I apologize, but the name of that daggone policy is escaping me right now. But those types of policies are what we talk about when we're looking at representation as a function of the interest group. A second function of the interest group is what we're going to call mobilization, where the interest group looks to get all of its members and even people that are not members but just merely sympathetic to the goals of the interest group, where the interest group is looking to get those people to work on behalf of the policy goals. That's what we call collective action. Interest groups pooling citizens to mobilize their resources in order to get, by resources, we're talking about money, and then we're also talking about worked out, right, time and expertise, get those people to do things in order to push that policy forward. By way of mobilization, we're looking at the various lobbying techniques. Your book has a number of them. Grassroots lobbying is the one that I'm more familiar with, right? Where you actually say that you're working for this interest group and then you get out there, for example, and go door to door to get regular citizens living in a neighborhood that will benefit from the policy, to get them to sign a petition, for example, in order to support that policy. And then you take that petition, take it to the government, and you say, hey, Mr. Congressman, we've got 500 signatures from this particular part of town that says, please vote negative on this referendum, something like that, right? Electioneering is the political activity and looks to influence the outcome of, elections. And so I don't know if you folks have ever done this, but, in past years when I had better knees, better, shoes and such, you would get out there, walk, pound the pavement, and get people to try to support your candidate for office. All right. And then a third function of the interest group, a third function of the interest group is going to be a watchdog function. Earlier, I mentioned the phrase oversight. So in some scenarios, the interest group is going to produce votesmart.org. The interest group is going to produce essentially a report card, and it's going to tell you how the positions that elected officials have taken on policy areas so that you can decide with the help of the interest group, whether or not you're going to vote for that elected official. This is my favorite webpage for that. This is called votesmart.org. They produce scorecards for various elected officials. Let's pay some attention to John Lewis, one of my favorite members of Congress. Now that we have identified that we're looking at John Lewis, let's look at his positions on the issues. Wrong, I meant to go here. Let's look at John Lewis's ratings, right? How the various interest groups have rated John Lewis. So based on the position of the interest group, you'll find that they either like John Lewis's stance or they don't, right? The National Right to Life Committee essentially says women should not have access to an abortion. They gave John Lewis a 0%. Planned Parenthood, for example, or the Pro-Choice America, they say women should have access to an abortion, and they gave John Lewis 100%. So if your question is, oh, I wonder what John Lewis says, what's his position on abortion, you look at these interest groups and you say, he is absolutely pro-choice. And that's the thing that you can do based on whatever your interest is in, right? Let's say that you're concerned about arts and entertainment. Let's say here, you're right, National Parks Conservation, they like John Lewis. Let's look at some people who won't like John Lewis. Let's see if we can find something like the energy policy, right? You look at some of these things here, and you'll see that John Lewis only has a 33% rating, 10 years old or so, but a 33% rating from the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. That means that these people are probably hostile to, nuclear energy, and it might appear that John Lewis took a vote that they didn't like, gave him a 33% rating for it. All right, so my point here is that the interest groups then perform a watchdog function where they rate elected officials, provide that information to the general public and to other elected officials in order to influence, one, the activities of that elected official, and second, to influence people's support for that elected official. And then program monitoring is that watchdog function, is that oversight function where they keep track of how the bills are filtering, rather how the bills are being used to make sure that they are having the desired effect. Now, let's pay some attention to the Schatt-Snyder argument again, right? What Schatt-Snyder told us, and what I'm looking to provoke you to think about, is that rather than being broadly representative of the American people, the interest group system at its most effective only involves a small privileged sector of the country, right? The most influential interest groups are those that are composed of Americans for the most influential, most privileged sectors of society. And the vast majority of the influential interest groups represent various factions of the corporate community. Most competitive interest groups do not, and by me, and I mean to say do not, represent the interests of poor people, not working class, not middle class. I'm talking now about poor people. 16% of this country has a household income underneath $24,000 a year. Family of four equals 2 working adults, and those 2 working adults with their couple of kids are making under $24,000. 16% of the country is in that circumstance. And so a political system that is responsive to pluralism might actually be representing the interest, over-representing the interest of the educational and economic elite, and might be under-representing the interest of working class people, and severely under-representing the interest of poor people. So that then presents interest groups, that presents us with a fundamental existential question. American politics is practiced in a society where the prevailing economic and social structures guarantees significant inequalities in the material conditions of the people, and it guarantees great disproportionalities of power amongst those people. So what do you do with this political system, right? To be sure, the interest groups that are the most viable tools of democratic politics, the more viable than elections, because they do allow people to be continuously and directly involved in the political process. If you say that you are a voter and all you do is vote, and if all you're doing is voting, you might not be maximizing your democratic potential, right? Because at bottom, you're going to vote at max once a year. Is sometimes only every 2 years. Most people, 60% of the American people, only vote once every 4 years. If you're doing something once every 4 years, are you in fact that thing? If voting makes you a fully functioning citizen, but you only vote every 4 years, are you a full citizen? Instead, Interest group activity is the more viable tool for political participation, because once you join that group and pay some dues in order to support that group, then you're going to have a group of people who are paid by that interest group to represent your interests before governments on a continuous basis. I'm talking day to day. I'm not talking year to year. So one way to test whether or not interest group activity is actually representing the goals of the people or representing the narrow goals of a privileged economic and educational elite. One way to do this is to look at the backgrounds of the people that are inside the White House, past and current, and look at where these people come from. If you have people that are representing the, you just look at where they come from, and then you look at some of the output of their policy, and you're able to make a strong empirical decision about who these people are and what they support, right? So this is what the rest of these slides do, starting from the Bush 43 administration. Then we move into some Obama activity, and then I was looking at some Trump activity with that Robert Mercer links there. All right, this thing is telling me that I should stop, so I'm going to pause the recording now. Dr. Lee Jones in the house with you. Thank you for listening.